Section 30 of John Inglesant, A Romance. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. John Inglesant, A Romance. By Joseph Henry Shorthouse. Chapter 21, Part 1. Inglesant travelled to Marseilles, and by packet-boat to Genoa. The beauty of the approach by sea to the city, and the lovely gardens and the country round, gave him the greatest delight. The magnificent streets of palaces, mostly of marble, and the thronged public places, the galleries of paintings, and the museums, filled his mind with astonishment, and the entrance into Italy, wonderful as he had expected it to be, surpassed his anticipation. He stayed some time in Genoa, to one or more of the Jesuit fathers in which city he had letters. Under the guidance of these cultivated men, he commenced an education in art, such as in these days can be scarcely understood. From his coming into Italy, a new life had dawned upon him in the music of that country. Fascinated as he had always been with the church music at London and Oxford, for several years he had been cut off from all such enjoyment, and, at its best, it was the prelude to what he heard now. For whole hours he would remain on his knees at Mass, lost and wondering in that strange world of infinite variety, the Mass music, so various in its phases, yet with a monotone of pathos through it all. The musical parties were also a great pleasure. He played the violin a little in England, and rapidly improved by the excellent tuition he met with here. He became, however, a proficient in what the Italians called the viola d'amore, a treble viol, strung with wire, which attracted him by its soft and sweet tone. Amid a concord of sweet sounds, within hearings of the splash of fountains, and surrounded by the rich colors of an Italian interior, the young Englishman found himself in a new world of delight. At the very soul of music, at one moment merry, and the next mad with passion and delightful pain, uttered itself in the long-continued tremor of the violins. It took possession in all its power of Inglesant's spirit. The whole of life is recited upon the plaintive strings, and by their mysterious effect upon the brain fibres. Men are brought into sympathy with life in all its forms, from the gay promise of its morning sunrise to the silence of its gloomy night. From Genoa he went to Siena, where he stayed some time, the dialect here being held to be very pure, and fit for foreigners to accustom themselves to. He spoke Italian before with sufficient ease, and associating with several of the religious in this city, he soon acquired the language perfectly. There can be nothing more delightful than the first few days of life in Italy, in the company of polished and congenial men. Inglesant enjoyed life at Siena very much. The beautiful, clean town, all marble and polished brick, the shining walls and pavement softened and shaded by gardens and creeping vines, the piazza and fountains, the cool retired walks with distant prospects, the Duomo, within and without of polished marble, inexpressibly beautiful, with its exceeding sweet music and well-tuned organs, the libraries full of objects of the greatest interest, the statues and antiquities everywhere interspersed. The summer and winter passed over, and he was still in Siena, and seemed loath to leave. He associated mostly with the ecclesiastes, to whom he had brought letters of introduction, for he was more anxious at first to become acquainted with the country and its treasures of art and literature than to make many acquaintances. He kept himself so close and studious that he met with no adventures such as most travellers, especially those who abandoned themselves to the dissolute courses of the country, meet with, courses which were said at that time to be able to make a devil out of a saint. He saw nothing of the religious system but what was excellent and delightful, seeing everything through the medium of his friends. He read all the Italian literature that was considered necessary for a gentleman to be acquainted with, and, though the learning of the fathers was not what it had been a century ago, he still found several to whom he could talk of his favorite Lucretius, and of the divine lessons of Plato. When he had spent some time in this way in Italy, and considered himself fitted to associate with the inhabitants generally, the Benedictines took Inglesant to visit the family of Cardinal Chigi, who was afterwards Pope, and who was a native of Siena. The cardinal himself was in Rome, but his brother, Don Mario, received Inglesant politely and introduced him to his son, Don Flavio, and to two of his nephews. With one of these, Don Agostino di Chigi, Inglesant became very intimate, and spent much of his time at his house. In this family he learnt much of the state of parties in Rome, and was advised in what way to comport himself when he should come there. The Cardinal Penzioruolo, who, with the Cardinal Patron Pamphilio, had lately been in great esteem, had just died, having weakened his health by his continued application to business, and the Pope had appointed Cardinal Chigi his successor at first Secretary of State. The Pope's sister-in-law, Donna Olympia Maladacini, was supposed to be banished, but many thought this was only a political retreat, and that sight still directed the affairs of the papacy. At any rate, she soon returned to Rome and to power. This extraordinary woman, whose loves and intrigues were enacted on the stage in Protestant countries, was the sister-in-law of the Pope, and was said to live with him in criminal correspondence, and to have charmed him by some secret incantation, the incantation of a strong woman over a weak and criminal man. For a long time she had abused her authority in the most scandalous manner, and exerted her unbounded ascendancy over the Pope to gratify her avarice and ambition, which was as unbounded as her power. She disposed of all benefices, which she kept vacant till she was fully informed of their value. She exacted a third of the entire value of all offices, receiving 12 years' value for an office for life. She gave audience upon public affairs, enacted new laws, abrogated those of former popes, and sat in council with the Pope with bundles of memorials in her hands. Several satires were daily pasted on the statue of Pasquin at Rome. Yet it seemed so incredible that Cardinal Penzioruolo, backed though he was by the cardinal nephew, should be able to overthrow the power of this woman by a representation he was said to have made to the Pope. That when Innocent at length, with great reluctance, banished Olympia, most persons supposed it was only a temporary piece of policy. The Chigi were at this time living in Siena, in great simplicity at their house in the Strada Romana, and in one or two small villas in the neighborhood. But they were of an ancient and noble family of this place, and were held in great esteem, and were all of them men of refinement and carefully educated. They had made considerable figure in Rome during the pontificate of Julius II, but afterwards meeting with misfortunes were obliged to return to Siena, where they had continued to reside ever since. At this time there was no idea that the cardinal of this house would be the next pope, and though well acquainted with the politics of Rome, the family occupied themselves mostly with other and more innocent amusements, in the arrangement of their gardens and estates, in the duties of hospitality, and in artistic, literary, and antiquarian pursuits. The University and College of Siena had produced many excellent scholars and several popes, and the city itself was full of remains of antique art, and was adorned with many modern works of great beauty, the productions of that school which takes its name from the town. Among such scenes as these, and with such companions, Inglesant's time passed so pleasantly that he was in no hurry to go on to Rome. The country about the city was celebrated for hunting, and the wild boar and the stag afforded excellent and exciting, if sometimes dangerous, sport. Amid the beautiful valleys, rich with vineyards, and overlooked by rocky hills and castled summits, were scenes fitted both for pleasure and sport, and the hunting gave place, often and in a moment, to al fresco banquets, and conversations and pleasant dalliance with the ladies by the cool shade near some fountain, or under some overarching rock. Under the influence of these occupations, so various and so attractive both to the mind and body, and thanks to so many novel objects and continual change of scene, Inglesant's health rapidly improved, and his mind recovered much of the calm and cheerfulness which were natural to it. He thought little of the Italian, and the terrible thoughts with which he had conducted him were for the time almost forgotten, though, from time to time, when any accident recalled the circumstances to his recollections, they returned upon his spirits with a melancholy effect. The first that these gloomy thoughts overpowered him since his arrival at Siena was on the following occasion. He had been hunting with a party of friends in the valley of Montalcino, one day in early autumn. The weather previously had been wet, and the rising sun had drawn upward masses of white vapor, which wreathed the green foliage and the vine slopes, where the vintage was going on, and concealed from sight the hills on every side. A pale golden light pervaded every place, and gave mystery and beauty to the meanest cottages and farm-sheds. The party, having missed the stag, stopped at a small osteria at the foot of a sloping hill, and Inglesant and another gentleman wandered up into the vineyard that sloped upwards behind the house. As they went up, the vines became gradually visible out of this silvery mist, and figures of peasant men and women moved about, vague and half-bidden, until they were close to them. Pigeons and doves flew in and out. Inglesant's friend stopped to speak to some of the peasant girls, but Inglesant himself, tempted by the pleasing mystery that the mountain slope, apparently full of hidden and beautiful life, presented, wandered on, gradually climbing higher and higher till he had left the vintage far below him, and heard no sound but that of the grasshoppers among the grass and the olive trees, and the distant laugh of the villagers, or now and then the music of a hunting horn which one of the party below was blowing for his own amusement. The mist was now so thick that he could see nothing, and it was by chance that he even kept the ascending path. The hill was rocky here and there, but for the most part was covered with short grass, cropped by the goats, which Inglesant started as he came unexpectedly upon them in the mist. Suddenly, after some quarter of an hour's climbing, he came out of the mist in a moment, and stood under a perfectly clear sky open, the summit of the hill. The blue vault stretched above him, without a cloud, all right with the morning sun. At his feet the grassy hilltop sparkling in dew, not yet dried up, and the vocal with grasshoppers, not yet silenced by the heat. The hilltop rose like an island out of a sea of vapor, seething and rolling round in misty waves, and lighted with prismatic colors of every hue. Out of the sea, here and there, other hilltops, on which goats were browsing, lay beneath the serene heaven, and rocky points and summits far higher than these reflected back the sun. He would have seemed to stand above all human conversation and walks of men if every now and then some break in the mist had not taken place, opening glimpses of landscapes and villages far below, and also the sound of bells and the music of the horn came up fitfully through the mist. Why, he did not know, but as he gazed on this, the most wonderful and beautiful sight he had ever seen, the recollection of Serenus de Cressy returned upon his mind with intense vividness, and the contrast between the life he was leading in Italy, amid every delight of mind and sense, and the life the Benedictine had offered him in vain, smote upon his conscience with terrible force. Upon the lonely mountain top, Beneath the serene silence, he threw himself upon the turf, and, overwhelmed with a sudden passion, repented that he had been born. Amid the extraordinary loveliness, the most gloomy thoughts took possession of him, and the fiend seemed to stand upon the smiling mount and claim him for himself. So palpably did the consciousness of his choice, worldly as he thought it, cause the presence of evil to appear, that in heavenly solitude he looked round for the murderer of his brother. The moment appeared to him, for an instant, to be one appointed for the consummation of his guilt. The horn blew sounding the recall drew his mind out of this terrible reverie, and he came down the hill, from which the mist was gradually clearing as in a dream. He rejoiced his company, who remarked the wild expression of his face. His old disease, in fact, never entirely left him. He walked often as in a dream, and when the fit was upon him, could never discern the real and the unreal. He knew that terrible feeling when the world and all its objects are slipping away, when the brain reels and seems only to be kept fixed and steady by a violent exertion of the will, and the mind is confused and perplexed in thoughts which it cannot grasp, and is full of fancies of vague duties and acts which it cannot perform, though it is convinced that they are all important to be done. The Cheeky family knew of Inglesant's past life, and of his acquaintance with the Archbishop of Fermo, the Pope's nuncio, and they advised him to make the acquaintances of his brother, the Cardinal Runusciini, before going to Rome. If you go to Rome in his train, or have him for a patron on your arrival, you will start in a much better position than if you entered the city in an entire stranger. And the present is not a very favorable time for going to Rome. The Pope is not expected to live very long. Donna Olympia and the Pamphili, or pretended Pamphili, or the cardinal nephew, is not a Pamphili at all, are securing what they can, using every moment to enrich themselves while they have the power. The moment the Pope dies, they fall, and with them all who have been connected with them. It is therefore useless to go to Rome at the present, except at a private person to see the city, and this you can do better in the suit of the cardinal than in any other way. You may wonder that we do not offer to introduce you to our uncle, to the Cardinal Cheeky, but we had rather that you should come to Rome at first under the patronage of another. You will understand more of our reasons before long. Meanwhile, we will write to our uncle respecting you, and you may be sure that he will promote your interest as much as is in his power. The Cardinal Runusciini was at that time believed to be at his own villa, situated in a village some distance from Florence to the north, and Don Agostino offered to accompany Inglesant so far on his journey. This ride, though a short one, was very pleasant, and endeared the two men to each other more than ever, they themselves on the route. Indeed, they travelled so leisurely that they were very nearly being too late for their purpose. On their arrival at the last stage before reaching Florence, they stopped for the night at a small osteria, and had no sooner taken up their quarters than a large train arrived at the inn, and, on their inquiry, they were informed it was the Cardinal Runusciini himself on his way to Rome. They immediately sent their names to his eminence, saying that he had been coming to pay their respects to him, and offering to resign their apartment, which was the best in the house. The cardinal, who travelled in great state, with his four-post bed and furniture of all kinds with him, returned a message that he could not disturb them in their room, that he remembered Mr. Inglesant's name in some letters from his brother, and that he should be honoured by their company to supper. The best that the village could afford was placed on the cardinal's table, and their host entertained the two young men with great courtesy. He was descended from a noble family in Florence, which boasted among its members Octavio Runusciini, the poet, who came to Paris in the suit of Marie de Medicis, and is said by some to have been the inventor of the opera. Besides the Pope's legate, another brother of the cardinal's, Thomas Battista, Rinuccini, was great chamberlain to the Grand Duke of Tuscany. All the brothers had been carefully educated and were men of literary tastes. But while the Archbishop had devoted himself mostly to politics, the Cardinal had confined himself almost entirely to literary pursuits. He owed his cardinal's hat to the Grand Duke, and who was extremely partial to him and promoted his interests in every way. He was a man of profound learning and an enthusiastic admirer of antiquity, but was also an acute logician and theologian, and perfectly well read in church history and in the controversy of the century, both in theology and philosophy. Before the end of supper, Inglesant found that he was acquainted with the writings of Hobbes, whom he had met in Italy, and of whom he inquired with interest as soon as he found Inglesant had been acquainted with him. End of section 30. Read by Elijah Fisher.